We met for lunch a few months ago now, and we talked about what we'd like to talk about. And I said I'd really like us to discuss misogyny because it's a term which is rarely discussed, actually, although people raised it as a word and then sort of put it back down again. And then we realised that we could talk about misandry as well. And I had to ask what that meant. So I'm going to start by perhaps asking you to, perhaps we both define what we think those two words mean.
I mean, I would love to hear from you first.
Okay.
Rather than starting with the man trying to define.
That's me.
Yeah. But just, as a woman, I would love to, I'd be curious, like what has been your experience around misogyny? Like how do you experience it in your daily life, throughout your life? Is it a daily experience?
Okay, well, I think that I would distinguish between sexism and misogyny. But like a spectrum of other things to do with behavior, casual sexism, overt sexism, when it starts moving towards something which is actively desiring to humiliate or hurt, you then are onto the border of misogyny, and then you're into something called misogyny. So, I mean, I'm going to start with the experience of being a young woman looking at horror movies, and me being a blonde girl. Which is that I can never lose the idea that some people enjoy watching blonde girls running for their life through woods, knowing that they're going to be caught at some stage and something horrendous is going to happen to them. And the idea that is a pleasurable thing for people, it is, well, that was my first experience, I suppose, of something which is popular entertainment. But for, I don't know whether this tallies with any of you, but for a young blonde girl, it's left me with the impression that I'm never safe in woods and streets and all the rest of it, for this unknown terror, which includes the idea that actually I exist to be a victim. So that's that's just something in my sort of folk memory from a very early age, which I only later began to think, actually, that's a constructed image. And then you take that further and you think, well, if that's a nice thing to do, chase girls and to terrify them and hound them and turn them into prey, which of course is quite a psychopathic thing to do. But the fact that the psychopathic nature of that becomes popular entertainment, I experience that as a sort of enjoyable playing with a victim, and that victim is a woman. So I call that misogyny, but it's so endemic into popular entertainment that people would probably find that extreme of me to say, but just in terms of how I experience it. So that's, from an early age, that feeling. You then move on to other images in popular entertainment, which are ones where women being slaves in some way, to be hurt or mutilated or made fun of, or just kept at the margins like little dogs or pets. That feels immensely distressing to me, because you feel as if no matter what you do, and here am I, we all know I'm the artistic director of the Southbank Centre, but you just think, well, finally I can be made nothing by this idea of all the other women. So all other women being used in that sort of way, anonymously, does affect me, and I feel humiliated. And then I suppose the other experience of misogyny, which is so painful, is when you realize that raping women as a weapon of war, or torturing them in a particularly sexually depraved way, an act by states or armies or criminal gangs that is designed to say, we would want to hurt you anyway if you were a human, but we're going to hurt you extra specially in a particular way because you're a woman. And it still baffles me what it is in, if I say men, I don't mean individual men I've met, but the male species, what it is in the male species that has some glimmer of the idea that hurting women specifically because they are women would be acceptable or a good thing, or that's and I've often wept, not because I've been hurt, but looking at women being humiliated in that way and thought, why do men want to do that? So that's my experience of misogyny, and when it turns itself, and knowing that I think a lot of men would not behave in that way, doesn't stop me feeling that they might behave in that way, that there's enough material around somewhere in their consciousness to collect it back up into misogyny if they were put into a situation either as an army or in a corporate boardroom or any other area where they suddenly went, do you know what, should we gang up on some women? I feel it is too near the surface for too many men and boys. That's what I feel about
Thank you.
misogyny.
Wow.
Does that surprise you?
No. It's, yeah.
So and one of the things that I suppose in reclaiming the idea that the women's movement was absolutely necessary, it's because I feel that unless women can help themselves feel that being pushed back by that wave of hatred that comes towards you, or antagonism or hostility, even if it's quite mild ridicule, that you do that to anybody, do it to any young person, just make them feel a bit stupid. They won't come back for more very easily. They have to have a lot of resilience to keep coming back and coming back. So if all around you have this, as I say, the spectrum from mild sexism through to extreme misogyny, then to enter public life and sort of stay there in areas that have that readily available. Women have to have a kind of gumption, which is more than perhaps one should expect of them. And yet they do need it, because we can only change atmosphere by being present. And so when I began to realize that the reason for not bringing feminism back in was partly because men were saying, we don't want all that hostility towards us. You made us feel bad. You seem to hate us. So if you're going to bring back feminism, could you be nice to us this time? Fair enough. I then thought, okay, well, in that case, can we discuss misogyny? Yep. And can we ask men to take a lot more responsibility for, A, acknowledging it, and then, B, helping us do something about it? And so that led me to think, well, is it primal? Is it something that will never change? Or is it something that men kind of would also like to see put into a slightly different situation?
Well, thank you for sharing those things. After we talked and as I started to think about this topic, one of the things that struck me was I do think we need to make a distinction between the individual misogyny of an individual man who you would talk to him, you'd hear what he says, and you would just say, that is a man who hates women. Mm-hmm. I remember the original name of the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo series was Men Who Hate Women. And there are some men in the world who hate women. In just that overt, translated into violence sorts of ways. I think on top of that, and this is what I think most men would hear that and they would see it and they say, well, no, I'm not like that. I love women. I care about women. Why are you using this blanket term? But I think that, following the contributions of feminist scholars and activists who've talked and written, as you have just very eloquently, just, you know, it's just, you didn't have to like think for long, you know, about, it was just like, it's right there, right? So part of your experience as a woman. I think there's a much deeper thing for men. And I don't think it's about being male. I don't think this is biology. But, you know, there was this wonderful speculation done by a feminist philosopher named Mary O'Brien, a Scottish-Canadian philosopher who's now dead. And I don't know if anyone is of the same age of me and remember her book, The Politics of Reproduction. But it was a brilliant book, and one of the things she did was speculate on the origins of patriarchy. And she speculated that at least part of it comes from this very deep jealousy that men, you know, our ancestors way back felt had this unbelievable ability that women had, which was to bring life into the world. And I think that there's part of the gestalt of a male-dominated society is this profound jealousy, beyond jealousy, fear of women's power. I mean, this is the ultimate trick. I mean, you know, my goodness, you know, and particularly in an age where the male connection to that was unknown. And so, I do think that there's this deeper fear that gets translated into hatred. But I think where the hatred often comes out is not around females, although for some men, as I said, that is it. But I think that there's this bigger hatred of the principles that we associate with femininity. Because when you think about it, the ways that we raise boys to be men is this relentless drive to root out all those things that we've traditionally attached to femininity. So the ability to be tender, nurturing, loving, receptive, to take pleasure rather than just to give, whatever it might be. All those things, to be passive rather than just active. All these principles, we instill enormous shame, fear, humiliation among boys and men with any of those things. And I think that what happens is that men tend to externalize those things rather than seeing all those things are part of the human birthright, having this whole range of feelings and possibilities. What we do is we externalize them. We project them just onto the other half of humanity. And then how do we justify that we've lost that in ourselves? Well, we vilify it. And I say we as some sort of collective, historically, men have done this. I don't mean, that you and you and you. So I think that there is this collective fear and hatred of the things we associate with the feminine. And fear, hatred, jealousy, particularly if it's in oneself. But then in some men, that does then that coalesces into these sort of pathological levels of direct misogyny.
Okay, well, if that's the case, that this relentless drive to establish maleness as what it doesn't have, as well as what it does have, well, first of all, why? Is my first question. Why does that constitute maleness?
And this is the thing, this stuff is just cooked up. It's ridiculous.
Who cooked that up then?
I'm trying to still find his name, but this is like the collective experience of male-dominated societies. And we can see that because our definitions of what it means to be masculine, or feminine for that matter, of course vary from culture to culture, era to era. So it becomes this collective expression, and it does vary. But but a set of core things that we assume and we justify and we articulate and we reproduce men's power by associating a set of qualities with being powerful. It's nonsense, and it's like everyone out there in here, wherever, is taking the same drug and we're having the same hallucination. Oh yeah, that's masculine, that's feminine. Where actually those things are just a creation. And so that original feminist contribution of making that sharp distinction between sex, biological sex, and gender, our many different gendered experiences, is such a salient one here. To challenge that, to challenge any sort of notion that somehow we're stuck with this stuff forever.
Well, I'm assuming that in some way we won't be stuck with it forever. I mean, I think one has to hope that is the case. Obviously, you read all kinds of material from as far back as writing began, And women have railed against the treatment that they've received at the hands of men. And men have ridiculed women from the beginning of writing. So this, I really hate the phrase battle of the sexes, actually, because it just is so kind of reductive. But this tension, which is obviously something to do with sexual need as well. I mean, the complication of need and desire is in there too. But you wouldn't think that the power balance of governments would be so regimentally divided against women being part of it. I mean, that seems, it's almost like an absurd line that has been drawn between men and women, that men have to have power and women can't have it. I mean, I can completely understand if you say, look, because you have children, could you just stay with them and I'll go out and get the lion, if lions are what you get. But
bring home the tofu.
Bring home the tofu. But the reality actually is, when you look back into history as well, that is not really what's ever happened either. No. Women have also been out doing the cropping, getting the water, etc., etc. And men seem to have found a way of saying, well, whatever men feel like doing, even if it's just playing dominoes in Greek cafes, whatever men are doing is men's work, proper with a W. And whatever women are doing is sort of what they should be doing, because that's what women do.
Right. I don't work, I'm just a housewife.
How did men accumulate that level of power, do you think? Was it fork, brute, what was it? Why have we been so, why have we been so duped?
I don't think women were duped. I think men used violence to enforce that. I think individual men still use violence. When we think, I'm sure there's some women here who've worked in a women's shelter, and you do intake, and a woman say, when did this happen? And a woman would say, well, he didn't like dinner. And so you're thinking you have a broken jaw because he didn't like dinner. And of course it's not about dinner. It's him. He is using violence as a tool to maintain his power, which is how any system of domination has ultimately existed. That's how slavery existed for so long. It was a white minority with using violence or the threat of violence. So I think it's partly through violence or the threat of violence. But then ideology starts kicking in really quickly. And so we have these massive religious establishments, for example, and systems of belief. I was just, my dad and I, who's 97, just as a fun project, we thought, let's read we're Jewish, read the Torah, read the Bible together. And I don't know if I was just rereading the story of Sodom. Anyone actually read that thing? This is unbelievable, to talk about hatred of women. So, I think it's Abraham who shows up in Sodom to rescue, I can't remember who it is, his friend. And so he goes to the house of Lot, and Lot takes him in. And as the visitor, there's this crowd that assembles outside because they want to have, they want to basically, rape Abraham because he's this, fresh meat, I guess, or something like that. And it's interesting. So Lot says, because Abraham's his guest, he says, oh, I can't send you out there. So he yells out at these men, basically, he's my guest, you cannot touch him, but would you like my daughters? So this stuff is so inscribed in our religious traditions, this deep, hatred of women, and just, you're just, you're fodder, So I didn't know I was going to get into the Bible.
No, I mean, I think it's really important, because one of the things that gets debated a lot is that it's not just the government structures that insist that power is best held in the hands of men. If all the major faith beliefs are saying basically that God is masculine, then both democracy and spirituality are no-go zones for women in terms of fully realizing themselves. So you're then left with domestic, in a sense. And in the domestic context, you are then left with a workload that is unbelievably significant, whilst still being in a situation where you're not actually the head of the household finally. I mean, there's lots of laws that we all know about, not being able to have your own bank account until recently, not being able to borrow money. I still know people who have shared bank accounts where the bank manager actually really doesn't want to talk to the wife, etc. And being able to rape your wife in marriage until 1989, etc. But But the idea that all of these things are in place seems to have made it very difficult for women to come out en masse and protest against it. I mean, I'm very aware that although the women's movement was very significant in the 70s, it was very significant for suffragettes, and there's a comeback now, which is great, I also feel that we almost haven't taken on lock, stock and barrel the entirety of what society has set out for women and how marginalised women are. We just somehow are still not going there, and we haven't managed to get men to understand how extreme it is. And so, whereas you talk about slavery and anti-apartheid, for example, I think the lines were really shown. You really were able to look at racism and say, we know what it looks like, we know how it exists, we know the consequences of it, and it cannot carry on happening. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I'm simply saying it's been outed. Yeah. But I don't feel that misogyny and sexism has actually been outed fully still. No. If we had outed it, we wouldn't be voting for a pope. I say we're nothing to do with it. We wouldn't be in a situation where you could even allow the House of Lords to have a special section just for bishops who can only be male. So for me, in a modern 21st century situation, or sitting here as we are, I just feel that we are ducking the issues still. And I don't know how we've managed to remain in that situation. Yeah. And I feel as if men, good-hearted men, as well as bad-hearted men, are kind of going around going, I hope they're not noticing. I hope they're never really going to fully notice, because if they did, you know, the revolution would be unstoppable. That's what it feels like.
And you know, I think one of the reasons, I mean, there are a lot of people who don't want to give up power, and they tend to be men, because ultimately feminism, as far as I understand it as a pro-feminist man, is not just about women entering into the institutions of power as they exist, but transforming society. I mean, one of the things that I think we've lost collectively, again, some of you will remember the original term of the women's movement in the late 60s. It wasn't, no one talked about equality. It was talking about liberation. Mm-hmm. And I think we've lost that spirit because, you know, I can tell you as a man, you really don't, you know, it's setting your sights low to think you just want to be equal to me. I mean, you know, women should, I'm not saying, you know, obviously, you know, when we struggle for equal pay and equal access to institutions, yes, we've got to talk about equality. But, you know, that original feminist inspiration of human liberation. And I think that's terrifying to a lot of men, because what your challenge, that you're throwing out a challenge to the men in this room by saying, you know, why aren't you able to do more, think more, challenge more, to rid out sexism and misogyny? That goes, it goes to the heart of who we are as men, which makes it for you know, it adds a whole other level of challenge, because this stuff is so deeply embedded, our assumptions about gender. Because, as I was saying earlier, we take it into our developing brains, and it's how we react to the world, how we think about ourselves. It's such powerful stuff. So it's frightening. It's frightening so for some it's just, you know, giving up power, but there's this other level of just, it's like if as soon as we open up, it's like holding up the sign, oh, I'm not a real man. And what does that mean? Well, it means that I'm going to get beat up. Because just as you talked about your early experience, I can tell you that every man in this room can remember probably the name of the guy who beat him up when he was 9 or 10 or 12 years old. This is, you know, these experiences are so powerful. Or the name of the coach who humiliated us because we weren't, you know, tough enough, or we weren't, you know, whatever enough. Now, I'm not equating that with women's experiences, because we still had power. But what I'm saying is that there's enormous fear attached to change, and unfortunately, I think that gets externalized into this sort of general societal hatred of not just of women, but of what women have stood for. Because how else could we justify not embracing that as part of our lives? Mm-hmm. But sorry.
No, go on.
But which comes to the question that, you know, we were also talking earlier about this I don't even know if it's been around that long, but I assume it's a made-up term, misandry. which, how many of you have heard this term? We were, and maybe someone knows this because we were trying to figure out if this has been, it's a term that gets associated with sort of the men's rights groups, the fathers' rights groups, the idea of an equivalence with misogyny, but it's sort of hatred of men. And so it's interesting how that, like, let me ask you, as a feminist woman, like, do you feel that there's, among the women is there a misandry? Is there a generalized hatred of men?
No.
There we have it.
No, there's not a generalized hatred of men. There's a range of feelings that go from bitterness, disappointment, anger, there's dismissal. So there are a range of emotions, and kind of disappointment being one of the big ones, I would say. And along with disappointment, of course, is the other voice that goes, well, I'm obviously not worth enough because they haven't bothered. And you've got to keep reinforcing the idea of, no, that's their fault. And then you don't want to think that, really, because you don't want to be disappointed. Because, you're in loving relationships with lots of men and lots of men are your friends. So I think my experience is that most women keep giving men the benefit of the doubt. Because on a personal basis, you're living with them. And you think, well, I know why you're like that, and da-da-da. So the occasional weapons that women can use to exert power, which might be really quite rare. I mean, there's that famous play, where it was Greek, where women withhold sex in order to stop men going to war. And I've often thought, would we all be able to do that? But, we don't confer enough to know whether that would be a useful thing or not. Women don't have a way of collectively humiliating men. I am aware that it isn't helpful for women to kind of make lots of jokes about men all the time, any more than it's helpful for women, for men to do the same. And I've got less and less comfortable with sort of, men and this, I think. I do feel uncomfortable about that now, because it's sort of a bit tit for tat and playgroundy, and I feel as if it sort of almost reinforces the idea that it's always going to be like that. And I don't want it to stay like that. I don't want to suggest that because men appear not to be able to multitask, say, in certain contexts, that means that they are incapable of doing it. A, because it's inconvenient, if you carry on thinking that. But also, it sort of suggests that's the limit and they won't go any further. And that's been done to us, and I don't want that. So, but I can't think of an example where men would look at, say, videos and see themselves being sort of strangled by women, or carved into with knives, or multiply raped by women. I mean, I know these are things that are harder, but they're not necessarily harder. Women could do a lot of those things to men and then sell them on the internet, for example, but they don't. Do we?
No.
We don't. No. We don't. And I don't think we're planning to, are we? No. So I think that when men say to me the women's movement was full of women who hated men, I would say the women's movement had women who got so angry that in the end they thought, you don't listen, you don't hear, you don't understand, and you're not even trying. I hate you. Well, I mean, I say that to my kids. It doesn't actually necessarily equal hate. I did, but the my daughter's here. I love her, but and of course, if you feel like nobody's listening and nobody cares, you'll say, and I don't even want to share the same space with you anymore. I'll go and sort this out for myself without you. Now, I think that women want men to take on other men for them. I mean, this is a big thing for me now, right? I often say to parents, as particularly to fathers, if you endorse your daughters, you can't. This is an amazing thing. Women need the endorsement of men. They need the love of men. They need the support of men. And when they see men not coming up against the bullying against women, which is then hatred, you just think, well, men don't care enough about us. Is that true? Don't you care? I mean, you're doing, I'm not asking you to be all men.
Yeah.
And obviously your job is going around trying to get men to care about these things. But why is their fear about their own image greater than their care and compassion for us?
It's this, I think it has a lot to do with the way we pulverize boys into believing they have to live this lie. And so the fear of breaking out of that box is very intense. But thinking about this idea of hatred of men, a couple things strike me. One is, if I was in a group in which, as you said, I wasn't being listened to, others in my group were being, violated en masse. Let me just finish that sentence. I mean, what I'm trying to say is, I'm amazed that more women don't hate men more. I mean, one of the incredible things of the women's movement is it wasn't a movement constructed around the hatred of men. It was constructed, there was anger, but yeah, 8,000 years, a lot of anger can build up, I would say. But when I think about this sort of hatred of men, there is a huge amount of hatred of men out there, and it's by other men. I mean, I hear these sort of men's rights types say, oh, this is a, misandric, or whatever the word would be, adjective would be, society, we send off our young men to war to be killed, and this happens. And I'm thinking, yeah, who's sending them off? This is not women doing this. Is men are sending our sons off to be killed. Men are writing the TV shows that are making fun of men and what, idiots and dolts we are. And so, I remember sitting around with a group of high school principals. I was doing a workshop for them once. And before it started, they were sitting around. It was like typical. This is a scene that every man here will relate to. They were sitting around talking to each other. They go, John, where the hell you got that suit? And the other said, well, not the same charity shop you got yours. And it was like back and forth put downs. And the one of them said about his best friend, he said, yeah, Jim's a good shit. Anyway, later on, they started talking about feminism, saying the problem with feminism is they're a bunch of male haters. And I said, wait a minute. I heard you guys talking among yourselves, and it was just like all you could do was put down each other. And the most affectionate thing, I point to the guy who said this thing about his friend Jim being a good shit. I said, the most affectionate thing you could say about your best friend is that he's a turd. I mean, who are the male haters here? So I think one thing is, is missing that. The other thing is this false equivalence between what happens to men and what happens to women. Your experience that you related at the beginning, there are men who could say horrible things happen to them, absolutely. But that sort of generalized sense of harassment, intimidation, fear, belittlement, is not part of men's experiences. And that's because there's this false equivalence that the men's rights types make by saying, yes, there are some women who hate men, of course, just like there's some men who hate women. But the thing is, women don't have social power to enforce that hatred. Whereas men have the power to pass the laws, to pass the statutes, to run the religions that are based on those principles of misogyny. So it is so different, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just completely different. And I mean, I do think that power attracts psychopaths. I mean, I do really believe it. I mean, obviously...
Says the artistic director of the Southbank Centre. No.
Yes, it does. No, but I mean, what I'm saying is that people who have psychopathic inclination, they need a way to exert it. Yeah. And I couldn't hear you.
Yeah.
Could I ask you to stop associating extreme behaviours that you dislike, violence, for example, attraction to power with experience of mental distress and personality disorders.
Do you mean the use of psychopath?
Yeah.
That word?
For example. Because the majority of really nasty stuff that goes on in the world is actually committed by people who are sane. Would people who are sane
that wasn't the point I was
please
making.
Own that?
Okay, thank you. But that wasn't the point I was going to make. I actually was specifically saying that I sometimes consider that people who have the personality disorder called psychopathy, some of them do end up in power. I was making that specific point. And that, I think that there is a general need for ownership of sexism through to misogyny. But I also think that there are some very acute moments. I don't know what St. Paul was like, but St. Paul, for example, seems to have taken his ability to draw power to such a specific place, which includes extreme misogyny, and then imprint it into a whole way of thinking, as did Hitler against Jews. So, all right, we won't discuss that because it's obviously, it's a big story. But what I mean is that the idea of hatred can attach itself to power and have an enormous effect on society's thinking, which can then stay there if it's unchallenged. But the question which I do agree with you is how can ownership be acknowledged of this whole idea of sexism and misogyny? How can ownership, or everything you've said about men's fear, everything you've said about men, in a way, not necessarily understanding the level of humiliation and fear and intimidation that women feel, is it because they don't really believe us when we tell them what it's like? Is that why men are not mobilizing on behalf of women?
Right. I think part of it is that most men sadly don't listen. They're not in, we don't have, we devalue, men have learned to devalue listening. That's, because listening is being receptive to the world. And so I think that sadly there's a lot of men who don't listen. I think it's part of what we as men need to really push and train ourselves to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, so let's now hand some microphones to the audience. There's a woman here and there's a woman there. To start.
I just wanted to quickly pick up on what you said about listening. I think the reverse is also true, that we don't talk about it enough as women. Recently a friend of mine, excuse me, confided in me about some sexual harassment that she'd experienced, and it sparked off a chain of conversations where most of the women said, "Oh yes, I know," and then came back with a story of their own, and most of the men said, "Oh my God, that's terrible, I've never heard it before." So I think we need to bring it more into open conversation, and it's not just about the men not listening.
Yeah, so it could be that men aren't hearing enough of the number of times that women are experiencing these things.
And then the very back.
Yeah, there's what's only at the back there too. Have we only got one microphone?
Okay. I wondered, what do you think the reaction would be to, in the British media and society, if the cabinet was all women? Because we never had it. We never had a woman head of the Exchequer, never had a woman head of the MOD. What do you think the reaction would be like? Is it terror?
What would be the reaction if suddenly you had an all-women parliament? It would just happen tomorrow, yes? Michael, do you want to answer that question?
Think about it a second as we get
Okay, we'll gather a few questions and we'll answer them all, yes?
I just wanted to ask a question about what I think is a strange phenomenon of these men's group, and what seems to be an incredible amount of jealousy from these men's group of women, and they keep trying to sort of take arguments that women have made and try to fit it to themselves when it clearly doesn't fit. I'd just like you to speak a bit on the dynamics of these organisations and why you think they're popping up. Thank you.
Okay, can you just take the microphone to the back there? Sorry, there's a lady right at the back who's been waiting from the beginning. Sorry, it wasn't you actually, but it was the one right at the end.
Right in the end.
Yes. Have we got another microphone?
Hi. I I'm not sure about this idea of like men not listening, because I'm more concerned about building a movement with other women most of the time, because I know that sometimes guys don't listen. And I think the best way of making men listen is by building a movement within ourselves. I've heard men describe themselves as feminists. They would only do that if there wasn't a feminist movement to start off with.
Okay. Should we take those?
Sure.
Yeah. I think if you suddenly went to an all-women parliament, I mean, I don't know how you would do that, but I mean, if you suddenly had women in the cabinet, an all-women cabinet, I think it would force an awful lot of women to suddenly rethink a lot about capitalism. They'd have to really root and branch consider what capitalism did to the women of the world and the women of the UK, because capitalism is, and this is, I'm not on a political point, but I mean, capitalism is constructed around so many power bases that are held by men and advantage men. And you'd have to rethink childcare, you'd have to rethink distribution of labour, you'd have to rethink so much so quickly. It would be like a sort of social revolution, and all to the good, in my opinion. Because in a sense, I think it's only when you have that sudden realisation of what you would have to change to have an equal society. And I think that it would be very refreshing. That's what I feel. What do you think, Michael?
Yeah, I actually think that there would be more acceptance than we would imagine. Because I think that one thing, people are so cynical about politics that I think there's a lot of men who'd probably say, well, yeah, we gave a crack at it and have screwed up totally. Let's let them screw up for a while. I don't know. But it is about, I think this goes back to a comment I made about equality, that equality isn't enough. It's not just enough to have women in these given institutions of power. Like, I don't want to see a woman pope. I want to see no pope. I don't like seeing.
Yep.
I don't like the idea that one person or one small group should control 1 billion people, or whatever it is. I think it's absurd. Although they have nice shoes. I mean, it's true. But those red slippers, I tell you. But yeah, who knows? One of the things I really appreciate the comment at the back about the importance of the women's movement. I think that I've always called myself a pro-feminist man, because I felt that it's not to. I felt that feminism is that complex thing of both an idea about equality and transformation, but also a reflection of women's experience. And I might be able to support and embrace one of those, but obviously the other is not what my life is about as a man. But I think that continued challenge to men will push things forward. But I think one of the things that will push things forward, and I think, Jude, you were really getting at it when you're talking about what men can experience, is figure out how to change the experiences of men. And part of that has been through women's challenge. Part of it has been through women entering into men's spaces. Part of it is just through the demands of women on men. But I think part of it is also going to be about transforming men's lives. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing, and one of the books I'm starting to work on right now, is a book about fatherhood. Because I think that the transformation of fatherhood which we're beginning to see, is going to have a profound implication for the transformation of men in general, both in terms of redefining social priorities, work life, relationship of, as you said, the relations of reproduction, but just sort of defining what is valuable, what is important in our lives, and that is happening. I just had an amazing experience. I went to this fathers group. And this is not fathers' rights groups. This is like a group of fathers to discuss, their experiences. And so these were young parents, and one guy was this working class guy, worked for a company paving roads. And he's done 80% work while his partner is on, this is Sweden, right? So she's on 1 year fully paid leave or something. And then he's going to take off 7 months. So he said, I went back to my hometown, which is like the really conservative part of Sweden. He said, the Bible Belt. And I told my buddies that I was going to take off 7 months. And they said, this is really weird. And then they said to him, why don't you just take off the usual 2 or 3 months? And I laughed. I thought, the usual 2 or 3 months? This is what the conservatives say? So, this transformation is happening, and these sort of these progressive fathers groups. The network that I'm part of called Men Care is actually, we're starting these things. They're starting in Ethiopia, in Rwanda, in South Africa, in Vietnam, in Belarus right now. In Belarus now, there's a van that drives around from town to town to work with fathers on being better nurturers and caregivers. So I put a lot of faith in not sort of just trying to change people through ideas, but change them through their life experience, through their actual what they do.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to make up your point about men's groups, because obviously there's men's groups and there's men's groups, if you see what I mean. There's the kind of work that you're doing, which sounds, well, essential. Men talking, men sharing with each other the issues that they're frightened about, men owning up to what they're witnessing and allowing to happen. And I spoke to somebody who went on an intense men's course, which was sort of, and I don't want to mock this, but it involved, I'm not mocking it, it involved, running in the forest, putting on war paint, it involved, being naked, it involved lots of things that was to do with saying, you can be a warrior. You can kind of find that warrior bit that you've always been told is essential maleness. And in a way, you can experience it, and then you can, if you want to, have done with it. But, you are a man. It was basically like you are a man. And as a mother of a son, there is this mysterious thing, at least this is, I see it as a mysterious thing, maleness. There is something, maleness. I don't know what it is, but it seems to exist, in the sense that I think femaleness has a something, but I don't know what it is either. I just know I am one. And I'm not that, I'm not a man. So, and of course, cross-gender people are very, very helpful here, because they can actually discuss these different issues. And a long conversation I had with Anthony from Anthony the Johnsons, who's transgender, last year. He took a course of estrogen for a long time, and he said, in his opinion, all 7-year-old boys should be put on estrogen for 6 months, and all 7-year-old girls should be given testosterone, and then they should discuss the differences that it has made them have. I don't think that's going to happen through Michael Gove, but it is a sort of territory that I think is also fascinating, which is what is these essential things that is male or female, and then how do men and women get content with some of that without feeling that equals social practice. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it is so hard, of course, because part of it is that physical mystery. If you've if you for 98 or whatever percent of us who are 99 have inhabited one body that this sort of gets defined as this is the male body, this is the female body. The other half remains this. For me, anyway, as a predominantly heterosexual man, remains this like endless mystery. It's so it is something quite amazing and beguiling and all those things. But the problem is we go beyond that and we start assuming that there's this essential divide in terms of behavior and thoughts and characteristics, and I just don't buy it. I just think that so many of these differences are created ones.
I agree.
And part of for me, the inspiration of the women's movement is just watching my sisters, I mean literally both my sisters and my sisters, just sort of reclaim that half of humanity that 8,000 years of patriarchy robbed them of, and said, no, we want this to be part of who we are, and that's exhilarating, and I just hope more men can do that too.
There's somebody there with the orange jumper, yes?
I'll make this quick, which is just that in some parts of the world, like in America, the men's rights movement is quite dangerous, and it's gaining power in terms of the influencing the Republicans and influencing policy. They punch above their weights online. They seem very sort of vicious and very sort of almost so full of hate that they hate men as well as hate women. And they're linked with fascist groups. And there was that famous case in Wisconsin, the men's rights groups were so anti-domestic violence funding, they went for that state funding and got a men's shelter defunded as well, because they just didn't want any funding for, for domestic violence. So I'm just curious, whether your organization takes them on and has any specific, ways of dealing with them, because as a feminist activist, I have encountered them, and they are quite scary.
Mm-hmm. Okay. While the microphone's being picked, there's a woman here with the wristband. You can run down to that? That's one. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to talk about the gains and losses of patriarchy, because we've rather been assuming that all men have power and that patriarchy is really good for them and not very good for women. And also, I think we need a bit of a race, class, gender analysis in what we're saying, because, Jane, I really felt for you in the victim mentality, but the fact is that I wasn't even a desirable victim because I wasn't blonde. Secondly, we talk about... you've talked about patriarchal religions and perhaps forgotten about the pantheons, where there were lots of pantheistic religions, where there was Hinduism and so on, where there were very powerful images of women, and especially in Europe, in living, well, not living memory, but a few hundred years ago, we had lots of women who were healers and spiritualists in their villages, and we had a sort of campaign against witchcraft, which to my mind was a huge femicide of a huge part of the population, and akin to slavery. And it seems to me that we have that very deep in our psyche as women. If you stand up above the parapet, this is what happens to you. And I think there are two mythologies that we need to smash this afternoon, and that is that all men are powerful, because we know that most of the power resides with very few men, and that men are ideologically told they're powerful, and they take it out on the nearest woman, because they're not really. They're not powerful. And I think that's one of the myths that we need to smash. And the other one is that women just rolled over and took it for all these years, because I do think that women have been enormously powerful in the past. And if we look at some of the other cultures and the way it's manifested in different cultures, I think we will find some of the answers, rather than thinking that it's all bad news. Men have a lot to gain from the end of patriarchy, as well as something to lose.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. And can I take the microphone over here? There's somebody at the back over there. Could you put your hand up at the back over there? Thank you. The woman with the red jumper right over there. And while the microphone's going there, do you want to take the American?
Sure. Just very quickly on the men's rights activists. I mean, part of what those of us in the pro-feminist men do, I mean, we do take on those groups. And if you could see the number of comments that don't get printed on my website to my blog, the number of times I've been called a mangina and other such things. Anyway, no, it is part of our job to take on those men. I do agree they're dangerous, and the thing is, and I appreciate the last comment, because the thing about patriarchy, it's not only a system of domination of men over women, but of some groups of men over other men, and the incredible thing though is, because we still define male superiority, men tend to have relative power within their group. So you could be, absolutely poor man and exploited economically, but probably within your group you're going to still have more power than women, or at least be perceived as having, even if the reality may be different. And I totally agree. Some men then, because we're supposed to have power, will then use violence as a means to prove to himself and others that he really is a man. It's tyrannical.
I think your point as well about healers, witches, etc. There's a wonderful book, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, by Dale Spender called Man-Made Language, which just goes through basically all the words that are demonized, and then so many of them are female words, until women themselves internalize the idea that women are silly or wrong, or and don't hold up for these words that had great significance. And of course I understand that pantheism was a fantastic force at some stage, and traveling around India a lot as I have done. Nevertheless, you know, I'm very unpersuaded when I'm told in Indian society how important it is that this, you know, the strength of the female image, and then I see actually how Indian women really live.
Yeah.
Because it's not, I don't want to be fobbed off, to be honest, by, you know, iconography that tells me that women are powerful when the evidence is that it's not. Because Mary Magdalene's quite powerful, but, you know, so what? Over there.
Hi. I just wanted to speak on the points that were made earlier about women not talking enough. I think that, like she just said about women stepping up and then being crushed, what happens in terms of sexual harassment is women who do speak are losing their jobs or getting demoted or getting fired and losing their income. So I think women are speaking, and we're speaking to each other. What we don't have are the hubs or the situations in places of work where women can actually talk to each other at work and then go as a group and talk to someone. So I don't think women aren't talking enough. I think we're just not being provided with the provision to be able to come together and attack the problem as a whole.
Are there any men here who would like to say anything? Yes, there's a man here. Thank you. There, yeah.
Cheers. Thanks for it was really interesting. There was just one thing that you said about when men are seeing violence against women, why don't they step in? And I suppose one of the things that maybe is a factor is the fact that men don't want to come across as patronizing in some way, and I don't know if that actually resonates with how women sometimes feel, but certainly you wouldn't want to step in when a woman was being spoken down to and say, you know, hang on, and talk for her. So I don't know if that kind of, is a causal factor there.
I understand. Well, there's another man over there. Let's take a couple at a time. There's a chap there. You wouldn't mind running around there? Sorry, to get you on the go. 3 minutes to go.
Okay, I've got a couple closing things.
Hey.
Good afternoon. We saw in the last century that men were able to achieve a very great deal through trade unionism. Why don't the women institute an organisation similar to a trade union? It could maybe be structured along the same lines. It would have the additional advantage that if the trade union movement had a membership largely in factories and industry around the country, maybe because of the way that things are, the women in the women's trade union would not have to be alongside those men. Maybe that would be a little bit of a bonus for them.
Independent unions for women. Michael, do you want to take any of the points?
Yeah, no, do we have to wrap up?
Yeah.
We're there, okay. I'm glad other men spoke, so I didn't have to speak on behalf of mankind. One of the things that is, for me, really, you know, is so important, and we've talked about this over the weekend, is just the ongoing challenge to men from women, from the women's movement, from the women in our lives, because we know that holds out tremendous promise to strengthen our relationships, whether it's a personal sexual relationship or work relationship or friendship, whatever it might be, but also really pushing us to transform our lives as men. And it you know, sometimes I really believe, like often when I'm working with organizations, they'll say, well, you know, we don't think the men are going to be receptive. I haven't been to a country in the world in which, you know, starting to talk to men about working, and women's groups about working to engage men to end violence against women. Any place I've ever been, people all start by saying, oh, you know, I know it's easier in other countries, but here it's not going to work. I mean, you hear this everywhere. And I really believe that men have waited their whole life, to have an opening, to be able to be invited to embrace a different possibility in their life. I remember a wonderful story, if I could tell this, about a colleague of mine who had these 3 separate lives. And he was an avid athlete, and he looked like a Greek sculpture. I mean, his body was almost as impressive as mine, I must say. But no, I mean, this guy was. He was like, anyway, he was like that. And he was also a dancer. We know all the, cliches about male dancers, whether it was true or not. In this case, it doesn't matter. And he also led men's groups, like men's sort of consciousness raising groups. And until this one day, these 3 lives were separate. And it all came together in a scary way one time at the gym. He was coming back one day from the swimming pool, and to get from the pool to the locker room, he had to walk by the weight room. And he noticed that all the guys, this was an old-fashioned weight room, all the guys from the weight room were outside the weight room, crowded around a notice board, and they were just laughing and looking at it, and then they saw him coming down the hall, and it went dead quiet. They just stared at him. He glanced over and he saw that on the bulletin board there was a little 8.5 by 11 or A4, whatever it is here, piece of paper with his picture saying, talking about how he was leading these groups for men and he was a dancer and on and on. They looked at him in total silence, and he realized he had been outed as this, not just this jock at the gym, but this man with his other life. Anyway, he decides that this is not the day to linger around the, whirlpool. He really felt threatened. So he goes in, takes a quick shower. He's going to get out of there quickly. When into the shower walks the king of the weight room. Now, I don't know if you've ever hung around an old-style weight room, but there was always a king who may have been the toughest, may have been the meanest and roughest. This guy was all of the above. The king walks in, turns on the water, starts working soap over his body. My friend is over here like turning into a prune. And finally the king turns to him and points to him and says, "Charlie, that you on that poster?" Because everyone at the gym knew Charlie. And Charlie, who, as I said, was no small guy himself, all he could say was, "Yeah." And the king walked over to him and pointed a finger in his face and said, "You know something?" And Charlie said, "No. No." And the king said, "My life as a man has always been a rough one." And he talked about how he grew up with an abusive father who beat up his mother, beat him up, and how he learned at a young age that to survive, he had to be tougher and rougher and all the rest than all the other guys. And he could never let down this aura of toughness and roughness. He could not let it down until he saw this little piece of paper that said that Charlie was someone that he would be safe talking to. And with the water coming down and the steam rising up, the king of the weight room started pouring out his life story, a story he had never told a soul. Well, even though most of us men don't, present company accepted, don't look like the king of the weight room, there's a bit of the king in all of us. And I really do believe that this conversation, just the fact of inviting a man to be part of WOW, I didn't say this to you before, I was really quite moved by that, because it's like, it's like I get to read this diary, hearing these presentations and being part of, just hearing and learning. And to be the sense that we can be drawn into this conversation together is humbling, it's exciting, it's challenging, and so I'm really, I am moved by that. But I think that there are so many men out there, I think all men out there in some ways are waiting for us, are desperate for us to be able to find ways to reach them. And it's not going to be easy to do that, but to find ways to reach out to them with the continued challenge that you, my sisters, make to us, but also, where possible, with compassion, with love, where possible, but also, importantly, for men to be reaching out to other men with that challenge and with that compassion. So I just wanted to thank you and thank you all.
Okay, let me add the one thing.
Thank you.
When the women's liberation movement began, as you said at the back, the absolute essential ingredient was women talking to each other. we had to talk to each other. We had to say we value each other, we care about each other, we love each other, we love ourselves. And from that strength, you then think, and now we can have some sensible conversations with men too. And I think that is sort of where we're up to. So it's fair enough to say maybe men need to do a lot more talking, as you suggest, to each other. We need to encourage men, and men need to encourage these conversations to happen with men. Because if men do get to the stage where they relax and love themselves for what they could be, not just what they currently are, then they might turn around and be involved. So you might be saying, I think you might be very much clearly saying, actually men aren't ready to have some of these conversations with women yet because they haven't had it with themselves. I don't know whether that's true or not, but one of the things I think is that in WOW 14, we will obviously carrying on having conversations with men and women. We're doing a masculinity festival in 14, not really a festival, a sort of a conversation anyway. But to me, just as it is absolutely critical to drive racism out of the world, it is absolutely critical to drive sexism out of the world. It's critical. And so many instruments of cruelty are built around the principles of otherness and the power structures that go with that. And I mean, Michael and I don't represent humanity. I'm just a woman, and you're a man, and you're all men and women, and you'll have your own views about all of these things. So this wasn't a platform in which to say, these are the facts. Just to say, this is what I feel, and this is what you feel. But it's a conversation. I just want WOW to be able to have as many conversations about subjects which are difficult as possible, because we've got a go at it. We can have a go at it. And so muddled or difficult or complicated or unfinished as it all is, we should keep on talking. So thanks very much for this session. Thank you to Michael. Thank you.